Good afternoon, Charles Coulombe. Coulombe?
Coulombe.
Coulombe.
Of all people, you're half French Canadian. You should be able to pronounce the French Canadian name.
I'm already teasing you.
All right.
Charles Coulombe.
Well,
You are an esteemed historian. You are an esteemed lecturer. You've never been in trouble once in your life. Not even once. You've spoken at Oxford, you've spoken at Cambridge. I would like you to today have the joyful and whimsical opportunity to lecture us on why the monarchy and Catholicism can, for want of a better word, become happy bedfellows again in this particular nation. Have you got anything to say on the matter?
oh, quite a bit. Now, mind you, I can't say it nearly as well as my learned friend, Father Aidan Nichols, in The Realm and Christendom Awake. Two wonderful books I recommend tremendously on this very topic. But I do have a good deal to say. And it is a question that comes up both in this country and in the United States. Why should Catholics care about the death of the Queen, the accession of King Charles? Isn't it just a lot of Protestant frumpery? Blah, 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 blah. And the answer is no, no, and no. The truth of the matter is twofold. One, the roots of the British monarchy are, of course, Catholic. But more than that, those, if you'll pardon the expression, desiccated remains are the last example of what Catholic monarchy was like throughout Europe, all the way to Russia, really, if you think of the Orthodox as being in this area sort of Catholic. The sad truth of the matter is that before the revolutions of the 18th and 19th century and into the 20th, monarchism and Catholicism were virtually synonymous. Now, of course, in Britain, as in Prussia and Scandinavia and so on, with the Protestant revolt, things sort of switched around. But what's important to remember is this. From the time of Constantine, the Catholic Church and the Catholic state were very like the form and the matter, as St. Thomas tells us, the matter being the state and the form being the church. To be baptized was to become a citizen. The two were coterminous. And if you were outside the church, you were outside the body politic. The Reformation comes along, and in the countries where it triumphs, you have the strange situation where the remaining Catholics are put out. And yet, those state churches, including the Church of England, and the Church of Ireland, the Church of Scotland, and so forth, continue to function in certain ways as the church had. Now, they were no longer the conscience of the king, quite the contrary, but they nevertheless did serve that particular function. And in England in particular, the Catholic forms were maintained to a degree they were not in a lot of places in Europe and the rest of Protestant Europe. Now,
could I just ask you to trace back how you understand the monarchy theologically? Because primarily, theologically, the monarchy starts with Judaism, right? And the Jewish king and all that. They will sing Zadok the priest.
Indeed.
And Nathan the prophet anointed Solomon king. And obviously what you have, if you're making a theological argument in Catholicism about the monarchy, it is going to be nested and rooted in the Jewish experience of monarchy. Could you, first of all, open that up for our audience who might not be familiar with that basis theologically in Judaism, perhaps link it to Christ, the Messiah who came within the Jewish faith, and then how, or I know it's a big question, but then how that organically develops into something that's distinctively Catholic, but obviously nested in Judaism. So if you could do that for our audience, then we could probably be able to see that whole history traced out before we try and make conclusions about now and the relevance now. Is that fair?
Easy enough, sure. Well, basically, the Jewish, one thing that's often forgotten, because people simply look at the book of Samuel and they see that the Jewish people wanted a king, and especially since Thomas Paine first made the argument that, well, obviously God didn't want the people of Israel to have a king, and they wanted it anyway, and so it was terrible. Thomas Paine made that argument, and as he laughingly told John Adams, he made an argument for a book he didn't believe in, and was able to impress a lot of stooges. His words, not mine. Basically, as early as the book of Leviticus, God laid down what he wanted in terms of kingship for his chosen people. They wanted a king.
So it's not a pagan addition. It's something that is rooted in the God of the Jews.
Not at all.
Yeah.
The God of Israel laid down, while they were in the desert, what sort of a king he wanted.
Mm-hmm.
Now, when the time came that the chaotic rule of the judges drove even the Jewish people to distraction, they wanted a king, they initially did not want a king after the style already set forth.
Mm-hmm.
They wanted a king like the nations, and they got Saul.
Mm-hmm.
That didn't end very well. But when it was over, they got David and the Davidic covenant. And this is really a very, very important part of the story. Saul anoints David as king. And that anointing becomes a really, really big part of Jewish and later of Christian kingship. Now, David, of course, his dynasty was promised the rule, but not all the time and not everywhere. The heir, the rightful, legitimate heir to King David was Jesus Christ.
Mm-hmm. And that's elaborated in the genealogies that you get in the Gospels and all that.
That's why they go all through it on both sides.
Yeah.
Both his legal genealogy from his father and his personal genealogy through his mother, bearing in mind that he didn't have a human father. Mm-hmm. So, at the Last Supper, he united his Davidic kingship, to which he was heir, with the communio of the church. Mm-hmm. Of course, he did other things. He originated the sacraments, he started the priesthood, all that. Mm-hmm. But that was also the beginning of Christian kingship. And this is why in later ages, the washing of the feet on Maundy Thursday became an important part of the year in every Catholic court in Christendom.
Yes, of course.
It was because it was calling back to the foundation of Christian kingship. And from that time on, Christian kingship was seen as a participation in the kingship of Christ.
And in the Latin tradition, it comes through the word rex. I'm not actually sure what the word would be in Hebrew for king.
Malek.
Malek, okay. And what does that literally mean in the Hebrew?
King.
It means king, okay.
It's,
so that would be a word that perhaps Christ, as Hamashiach, the Messiah, would have identified with himself.
Yes.
When
absolutely.
they bring him to Pilate, they bring him to the Sanhedrin. This man says he is the
king of the Jews.
And in Hebrew it's...
Well, Malek...
this man says he is the king of the Jews.
Yeah.
Right. Well, that's there then, and it's rooted in the Jewish tradition. And then what you see is an assimilation of that piety through to Catholicism somehow?
You do indeed, because, well, it happened, of course, rather gradually, because, as I say, later on, Christian kingship would be seen as participation in the kingship of Christ. Yes. And that's why you have the anointing at coronations, that's why you have the Maundy Thursday and all that. But for the first 300 years, wherever we were an illegal sect.
Yeah.
And so our relationship with the state was basically paying its taxes, fighting its wars, and being murdered by it. That was it. But starting in 303, when Armenia converted, picking up steam with the Edict of Milan in 311, with Constantine, and sealed, as you might say, in 380 with the Edict of Thessalonica, whereby it became the religion of the empire. Theodosius the Great made baptism entry into Roman citizenship.
Yes.
And from that time on, the Respublica Christiana was church and state. There were two facets. Right. Yeah. They were distinct.
And you had kings present at the ecumenical councils from then on.
Precisely.
All the way through, actually.
All the way through.
All the way through.
From Constantine to Charles V.
Correct. Okay.
Now, and of course, that's why it was because of the emperors convoking the councils that ended various major heresies, Nestorianism, Monophysitism, and so on. Sure. They were able to do things, well, it's because of this sort of relationship that Otto the Great was able to end the 100 years of the pornocracy in Rome. It's why Sigismund was able to end the Great Schism, and Charles V convoke Trent.
So let's look at that period before we go past Charles V. I'm just curious how you see it, because the Reformed rejection of, let's say, a Catholic monarchy would be something along the lines of it's not biblical, and secondly, it's a kind of bastardization of secular and religious power.
Yep.
So the conversion of the monarchy in England, I'd say, would be inseparable from the restoration of the Catholic faith in this country in the fullness of its joy.
It would be.
We're in Walsingham. All the kings and queens came here on pilgrimage to consecrate England to Our Lady of Walsingham, right up until Henry VIII. So please tell us, because we are at the moment a church in protestation in a sense to this apostolic continuity linked to the monarchy, but tell us how it's a positive thing. Show us how these things go together in a way that we should convince us that there is good to be had in a Catholic monarchy in England.
Well, several ways, first and foremost. One is that as things stand now, the monarchy as we know it is the creation of the Glorious Revolution, so-called, of 1688. Prior to that time...
Could you explain that just for our audience, please?
Certainly.
Just a little bit more.
What happened basically was that the last Catholic king in this country, James II, was overthrown by, for want of a better word, an oligarchy made up of the well-to-do and the well-placed. These gentlemen overthrew him for fear that his newly born Catholic son would ensure a Catholic succession. And they invited his son-in-law, William of Orange, over to become king in the first successful invasion of England since 1066.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And that established a monarchy that was basically at the behest, and existed at the behest, and to give a good covering, you might say, to the role of the oligarchy.
Mm-hmm. Which is the opposite of what you think its spiritual power should be.
Oh, absolutely.
So could you unpack for our audience what a good spiritual monarchy, as it was founded in your argument by Christ to be, what that looks like, what its purpose is, how it relates to the citizen and all of that, and then I'll move on to talking about this in a modern context. But just as you would see it, what is the benefit of a Catholic monarchy in England?
Well, in England or anywhere else.
Well, yes, but... Yeah.
Basically, although, as we'll see, the hope for such a thing might be greater here, believe it or not, than elsewhere. But anyway, the thing you bear in mind is that Catholic monarchy had four major earmarks, is the best way I could put it. The first, you could say, was the altar. And that is, the church it established the rules. Every society has them. We have one. Every society has a state church, an animating philosophy. You know, there's really no such thing as separation of church and state. My church may very well be separated from the state, but there is an animating quasi-religious philosophy that sets the rules, determines legitimacy.
In Britain?
Everywhere.
Everywhere.
It's
okay,
a rule.
Yeah.
It's the way it is. It bestows authority. And this is a very important distinction, authority versus power. Authority is the right to say what ought to happen, as your doctor could prescribe for you. But power is the ability to make things happen.
Can you talk about that separation, just so I can see how you're setting that up? How are authority and power separated in a good version of the Catholic monarchy?
Well, in a good version, the king and the church, to a great degree, have the authority to say what ought to be. But power is very, very diffuse. What we would today call subsidiarity.
So it's in a sense different to Russia. I mean, we have separated the church and state, but you would like to see reinstilled a Catholic monarchy speaking with some authority on moral issues, whilst there's still a democratic conversation that leads the way these things will be implemented.
And to what end taxes should be raised.
Okay, well, yeah, fair
Can't
enough.
forget that part.
Yeah, sure. Well, I mean, that's certainly a curious argument that I think is rarely made. I would like to propose to you another criticism, see how you come back at it. I think part of how English people understand themselves today is we are not into that whole papal thing.
No.
The papal thing. Now, we had the papal visit of John Paul II.
Indeed.
We also had the first state visit of Pope Benedict. So these things have happened, and actually they were watershed moments, I would say, for an ongoing and burgeoning dialogue between the Catholic Church and English people in general, as well as our institutions.
No.
Having said that, speak to the normal English person, and the Pope doesn't feature high in terms of an authority figure in their life, and I doubt with modern sensitivities that could be, for want of the better word, attractive. So I want you to try and tell me, from your point of view, within the argument you're proposing, what sort of benefits there would be to have the papacy in England linked to a Catholic monarchy in a way that would actually benefit everyone. I'm just curious to see how you would set that up.
Well, one thing we all know is that the state we live under today has made itself the absolute arbiter of faith and morals. And we also know that everyone accepts certain authorities in their lives as infallible. Their doctor, their lawyer, whatever. So the argument you often hear that, oh, well, we don't want authority isn't true. We accept it. Not very long ago, we all hid out in our houses because our masters told us to. And this is something, I must say, that no medieval Catholic king would ever have gotten away with. Just as with even Henry VIII, who was in my humble estimation, the least worthy of the bunch. Even he could not pretend to change law. He had to pretend he was somehow going along with it.
Yeah.
Well, our masters don't make that pretense.
No, you're right. Yeah.
You see, in a certain sense, what I'm looking at is the opposite of what we already know.
Yeah.
Even when you're talking about absolute monarchy, that did not exist in the sense that our absolute regime does today.
Yeah, right. I mean, I think that's one of the things you could say about postmodernity in general. The postmodern experience is a crisis relating to authority.
Precisely.
There is no one you can defer to, and a crisis ensues where you don't know where to assign authority correctly. Now, one of the things I would say that is one of the great boons, let's say, one of the positive things we could say about a Catholic monarchy is try and see it how I would frame it. Before the Reformation, the monarchy and the temporal wealth of the church, they had a spiritual designation. They did not belong to the crown in the sense of how Henry VIII took the church's riches at the dissolution of the monastery and used them to fund political activism. He had a great war and a great party, let's say, in a nutshell.
Yeah.
Now, what happened at that point was that temporal power and spiritual power became horribly and inexorably connected in a way that has nothing to do with what Catholicism is at its heart. Because I would say, before the Reformation, that dedication of England to Our Lady of Walsingham, the land, the wealth, the riches, in its best light, in its true spiritual light. Now, of course, there are abuses and people exploiting that, and that's why you'd need a Reformation. But in its best light, it was to do with freedom. It was to do with freedom, because if you take authority from the apostolic tradition, you are conferring authority on something transcendent that you don't deserve, that you don't own, that you can't bestow upon yourself. And so your authority is actually rooted in something that is liberating, because it can't be purchased, it can't be attained through power, not in its true spiritual sense. And that's how I would pick that up. Anyway.
I would agree with you. And I would add, to touch on the papal office, you look at who it was who was able to intervene with King John. It was Pope Innocent III. The importance of the papacy and these sorts of things. And this is where you have this strange interplay, because you had popes who, shall we say, required a certain amount of restraint by emperors, and emperors who required restraint by popes.
Yeah.
You see,
we had an English pope, Nicholas Breakespeare. I don't know if you're familiar. You could tell us a little bit about him. What could you say about him in a nutshell?
In a nutshell, Adrian IV was the man who attempted to settle the anarchy in Ireland, and there was in church and state, by commissioning the English king to settle Ireland's affairs. That was the beginning of the so-called Lordship of Ireland. It's hard to bear in mind, to realize now, but because the religious element wasn't present then, the religious division wasn't present, the English and the Irish got on rather better then than they do now.
Right. Well, I mean, it's a curious fact of history that he isn't canonized, but there was an English pope, and you have some schools named after him in this country.
And like St. Patrick, he was a shepherd before he did anything else.
Sure. Well, there you are. And I want to tie up this particular conversation on the point of the monarchy with regards to the monarchy in Vatican II and modernism, and how you see these things interplay in a post-conciliar world. Things like Nostra Aetate, the Declaration on Religious Freedom, and these kind of concepts of conscience and things that are introduced by John Henry Newman and all that. Can all these things fit in well with a Catholic monarchy? Now, I personally would hope to believe that was possible. I'd just be curious to see how you would try and tessellate those things together.
Well, there are several things to bear in mind at once. One is, of course, that part of the Catholic monarch's job was the defense of the church against heresy. And it was the defense of the physical defense of the church if necessary. Now, in the Vatican II, you come into a very interesting thing. The church had struggled with the liberal state for a century and a half and lost every time. So I think, bearing in mind Benedict XVI's reading of the thing, as well as he put it when he declared the hermeneutic of continuity and the hermeneutic of rupture, he pointed out that in this area specifically, Vatican II had changed teaching, but he said that in itself was a teaching that had not been infallible. Well, if that is true, then the changes themselves aren't infallible either. Then the question is not, is it in keeping with Catholic dogma, but does it really meet the signs of the times?
Yeah.
We're sitting here in Walsingham.
Yeah.
And one of the things that has been developing, not just in England, but throughout Protestant Europe since 2000, has been the return of pilgrimage and the rebirth of shrines.
Sure.
Now, this is something, this is not an initiative that's come from the church. It's come from outside the church, but it reflects a hunger for what the church traditionally has had.
I fell in love with the Camino de Santiago. I've done it. I've walked across Spain. Most of the people doing that weren't religious.
Oh.
And I think that is exactly precisely the sort of thing that you're talking about. Now, if we go back just in terms of the history, I'm sure you're familiar, the stars in England were called the Walsingham Way.
Yeah.
Because as a pilgrim, you could journey to Walsingham following the stars, and we were the largest pilgrimage destination after Rome, Santiago de Compostela, and Jerusalem, where our hymn, "And did those feet in ancient times," is rooted in. So you can see that that pilgrimage tradition is actually just very native to what it means to be English. You've got it in Chaucer, but it's as deep as Ophelia. I'm sure you're familiar with Ophelia in Hamlet. She sings the Walsingham pilgrimage song as she drowns herself ambiguously, having gathered the flowers that all belonged to Mary before the Reformation. Now, Shakespeare's obviously doing something there with regards to the shock of rupture
and
knows what that would look like aesthetically.
And remember, too, that he's living in the immediate aftermath of the break.
Again,
and that
agreed. And I think modern discourse and scholarship is now taken away from any political motives with regards to interpreting Shakespeare, and it's much easier to show how unambiguously he's rooted in some kind of Catholic crisis. And because it's the only thing that was happening in England at the time.
This is true.
If you look at how many monasteries were dissolved, you can't see the land for the little points on it of monasteries that were there. Now, in all of this, permit me to enjoy myself and to start talking about Tolkien, because he has a book, does he not, called The Return of the King?
Oh, yes.
And I know that you and I go back a long way in terms of our, I wouldn't say frivolity, but certainly joy in terms of trying to get Tolkien canonized as not a Roman Catholic, because we don't use that term, as a Catholic and an Englishman. Now, within that, I would like to sort of open that up for our audience by referring to The Dream of the Rood, which I'm sure you're familiar with, which is a wonderful runically inscribed poem up in Scotland, which was then translated into Old English. And in that Dream of the Rood, you have a vision of Christ as a soldier and a warrior, reinterpreting the tradition of the annihilation of your enemy, which was Germanic, and turning warriorhood into the loving of the enemy, Christianizing this Germanic impulse of warrior destiny and might, and bringing within it the divine love. Now, that is something that is absolutely at the heart of what it means to be an English Catholic. And then if you look at things like the Genesis story translated into Anglo-Saxon, you have within that statements such as, "Us is rit Mitchell that we werda wuldur kunning modem lafien," also translated as, "It is right that in our hearts we should worship the glory king of angel armies, the Wuldur Kuning." Now, you see, why I'm bringing all this in terms of Tolkien is that he was enamored by the Anglo-Saxon language. And I think a great deal of what evangelization means in England is to reawaken the roots. And he said, and it's to do with Aragorn, and it's to do with the return of the king. So how does Tolkien, in his characters who are kings, exemplify a vision of the sort of monarchy that we have been talking about today, rooted in this impulse in the Genesis and Dream of the Rood spirit? How does Tolkien do that?
Well, his king is at once the, how do I put it? His king, we'll take Aragorn as crowned now. His king is the chief layman in the realm, as you might say. He's the guardian of truth. He's the guardian of the weak, which was certainly very much seen to be the king's job. The king's peace is a phrase we still have today.
And we all need a chief layman.
Yeah. Well, that's for sure.
We all need a chief layman.
And we don't have any today.
No, well, everyone needs a layman. There we are.
No, but the truth of the matter is that Aragorn really, he starts out sort of as a Bonnie Prince Charlie figure.
Right, yeah.
And then he becomes Charlemagne, the restorer of the kingdom,
Yes.
the remaker. Now, of course, what he remakes is not Arnor and Gondor as they were. It's rooted in them, but it's something new. It's not, because the restoration, when we use that word, you can never restore what's been smashed, but you can put some of the pieces back together.
Sure. And it's curious with him because he certainly goes on a long and winding journey of discovery to finally be anointed as the king. And I think that's interesting because it's not, in that sense, not something imposed, but it's something sort of romantically enmeshed with the narrative of life. You see, that's really where it lies, is some kind of giving a sacred dimension to the ordinary. I think that's possibly what is interwoven with Aragorn and all these figures, Gandalf, Frodo.
Well, see, and Gandalf, is very much a papal figure.
Sure.
He's the one who crowns Aragorn. But beyond that, remember when he's having his dialogue with Denethor, and they're arguing about what's needed to do in the current crisis. And Denethor says, as far as I'm concerned, there is no greater good in the world today than that of Gondor.
Sure.
And Gandalf responds, the Gondor and all lands are my interest, for I too am a vicar. Did you not, or no, I too am a steward.
Yes.
Did you not know?
Now, and you will enjoy this, Charles, I think, in terms of the etymology, because it's Denethor and it's Theoden.
Yeah.
And so the one who throws himself suicidally, well, he's rooted in the Thor tradition. But Theoden, he has a martyrdom, which looks like suicide because he throws himself into death. But it's not the same thing.
No.
Because as it's been touched by the secret fire, at least in terms of Tolkien's cosmology, that death, that kenosis of the self, is actually rooted in this spiritual grandeur. And I think that's why some people say, at least in Peter Jackson's version of the film, that moment gives them, hairs on the end of their arms stand up, because it's so powerful to see people face death with that pagan dimension of not fearing, but it being rooted in a spiritual reason as well. To finish our interview for today, God save the King, Charles.
God save the King.
God bless you and have a wonderful time here in Walsingham. It was so wonderful to be with you.
Thank you.
Thank you.